Greetings and salutations, my lovely courtiers. I have missed you. I'm sorry I've been absent for a while. I was waiting for a certain piece of equipment to arrive in the mail, and when it didn't, I ended up using my wife's Venus razor to just clean things up a bit. So tonight's story time is a special show. I'm doing this in honor of my dear friend Kelly Miller, who wrote a fantastic book called Death Takes a Holiday at Pemberly. If you know me, you know I'm quite a Jane Austen fan. Fan of all her works. I love every spin-off of it, every variation of it, Bride and Prejudice, you name it, every version of Pride and Prejudice. This is kind of like a sequel to Pride and Prejudice, where the embodiment of death goes to visit Mr. and Mrs. Darcy. Now, Death in this book is named Graham, and he kind of does a Meet Joe Black and takes over a really handsome guy's body, and unlike Meet Joe Black, as played by Brad Pitt, this character of Graham is very colorful. He's irreverent. He's very I don't know the word. He's inhuman, I guess is the best word. I mean, he's death, so he's supposed to be. But he also has a tender side that I kind of just I look for that in a book, something that can emotionally grab you. I really I gravitate toward that. So, without further ado, I would like to read you one of my favorite passages about Mr. Graham in the book, Death Takes a Holiday at Pemberly. I've given you all the premise you need. Anything else you need to know is they're going to visit Mrs. Green. As they entered the room, Mrs. Green closed her book and set it on the table. Adjusting herself to a sitting position, she gave her visitors a weak but genuine smile. "Mrs. Darcy, you are a sight for sore eyes. I do so enjoy your visits. And who is this stranger? Wherever did you find such a striking gentleman? I have never seen a man so handsome." FYI, Graham looks nothing like me. He looks more like Chris Hemsworth or, Chris Pratt. Someone, really handsome like that. Anyway, Elizabeth walked forward with Graham, who favored Mrs. Green with his most dazzling smile. "Mrs. Green, may I present my husband's good friend, Mr. Graham. He's visiting us from Calabria." With an exaggerated bow, Mr. Graham said, "It is my great pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Green." "I am so pleased to meet you, Mr. Graham." Mrs. Green pointed to the chair closest to her bed. "Sir, please indulge me by sitting here. My eyes are not what they used to be, and I have few enough pleasures these days. I should like to get a good look at you." Graham's hearty laughter lightened the atmosphere of the room as he took the designated chair. "You are most kind, madam. I feel privileged to have been afforded the best seat in the house. Sorry, in the room. Don't kill me, Kelly. I love you." Angling his head to the side, he winked at Elizabeth as she sat in the other chair. Declaring the need to look in on her daughter, Selina excused herself and left the room. Holding the distinctive jar decorated in black and white stripes in view of the older lady, Elizabeth said, "I heard from your daughter that you have a preference for pomfret cakes. Would you care for one now?" Mrs. Green clapped her hands and grinned. "Oh, you dear lady, I have been dreaming of those confections for a week." "They are an extravagance I have on rare occasions. Yes, please, I should love one, and I hope you will help yourselves as well." She opened the jar and handed one of the flat, round pomfret cakes to Mrs. Green. "I thank you, but to be truthful, I do not favor them." She offered the jar to Graham, but he shook his head and put his hand on his stomach. "If you recall, I ate a great deal at breakfast." She smiled at his gesture. His statement was true enough. She had never seen a man consume so much at one sitting. She set the jar on the table. Mrs. Green held the cake aloft to view its familiar engraving as she spoke. "It is true, not everyone appreciates these. My granddaughter and I are the only ones in my family who enjoy them." She took a small bite. A sigh slipped past her lips as she chewed the sweet confection. "Mrs. Darcy, I cannot thank you enough, both for the pomfret cakes and for bringing along this delightful young man for me to gaze upon. You are a flatterer. I should wager you turned a few heads in your day." Graham wiggled his eyebrows at the older lady. A touch of pink could be seen on Mrs. Green's otherwise pallid cheeks. "I suppose one could say I was attractive in my youth. My dear departed husband Thomas used to tell me I was the prettiest girl in Lambton." Graham beamed. "I knew I was correct. The true beauty of a woman is constant. It never fades away." A lump formed in Elizabeth's throat. Graham's talent as a charmer was impressive. It was no wonder Sarah was unable to resist him. The trio continued to chat in a light, cordial style. After a while, the elderly woman grew quiet, an apparent signal to a shift in her mood. Mrs. Green's smile evaporated and her eyes closed. When she opened her eyes, her visage had clouded. Her forehead was filled with lines. "I hope you will excuse my frankness. I do not have a great deal of time left on this earth. The surgeon, Mr. Cooper, has said that I may last a few days or less. I grow weaker with each sunrise, and I am ready to leave." She paused, taking several measured breaths. "I hope you will convey to your husband that my family and I appreciate what a generous and responsible landlord he has been." Moisture pooled in Elizabeth's eyes. "I am awed that you would think of this at such a time. I know I can speak for my husband when I say that it is a privilege for him to have hard-working tenants like your family at Pemberley. But I shall relay your message to Mr. Darcy." The elderly woman nodded. As her eyes moved toward the window, a doleful heaviness filled them. "I hope you shall excuse my impertinence," said Graham. "But despite your words, it is plain to me that you are aggrieved. It might help you to speak of it. Will you not tell us what is on your mind?" Mrs. Green smiled at him with an air of wistfulness. "You are a perceptive young man. My youngest son, Louis, is in the army. Last I heard from him was months ago, when he wrote to tell us he was to be sent to Spain. I had hoped to hear word from him before I pass away, but it appears it will not happen." Graham reached out to take her hand. "I have an unusual request. I ask that you close your eyes and picture your son, Louis." Her eyes widened, and she turned to Elizabeth as if to gauge her reaction to his words. Although Elizabeth took care to keep her countenance, her breathing grew shallow at Graham's peculiar request. What did the man have in mind? After a moment, Mrs. Green gave him a weak smile and closed her eyes. He closed his as well, his lips pressed together, his forehead contorted as if in deep thought. At length he opened his eyes, regarded the elderly woman with a grave expression. "Madam, I am aware of your son Louis's fate. Would you like me to tell you of it?" Elizabeth put her hand over her mouth, stifling a gasp. A smothering rush of heat spread through her. Did Graham imagine himself to be a soothsayer? Mrs. Green opened her eyes and blinked several times. After staring back at him for a long moment, she spoke with certitude. "Yes, please. I would like to know my son's destiny." Graham spoke in a soothing baritone. "Your son Louis was involved in a battle that took place in the mountains of Spain in June. He exhibited bravery and strength in his efforts in combat before being hit by enemy fire. I assure you, your valiant son did not suffer. His death was immediate. Drawing her hands to her face, Mrs. Green dipped her head and bewailed her loss. Elizabeth sucked in her breath, clenching her hands in her lap as the soft, mournful lament permeated the small room. Graham leaned towards the elderly woman, his brows raised in silent question. She took several shallow breaths, met his eyes, and nodded. He died as a hero. His actions allowed many others in his regiment to avoid injury or death. Lewis's last thoughts were of you. He recalled the day he left home and pictured you sitting outside in your favorite chair as you admired the blooming bluebells. You had baked him his favorite currant tea biscuits earlier that morning to take with him. With her eyes glistening, she nodded. Yes, that is correct. She pointed out the window. Right there. That is where it was when I last saw my Lewis. He hugged me as he said goodbye and told me he loved me. He squeezed the elderly woman's hand and released it. Do not fret over Lewis anymore. You will be with him again soon. And you will be reunited with your husband as well. Dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, she smiled at him. Mr. Graham, you have brought me a great deal of comfort. She turned to Elizabeth. I am grateful to you both for your visit. Now, if you will excuse me, I have become fatigued. Elizabeth, who had been staring at Graham with a slack jaw, roused herself to stand and face Mrs. Green with the semblance of calm. In that case, we shall take our leave now. Goodbye, Mrs. Green. Her smile was faint. Goodbye, Mrs. Darcy. Mr. Graham. It's called Death Takes a Holiday at Pemberley. Definitely worth the read. I also want to mention that those of you who are new to my website, lordvale.com, if you sign up to be one of my courtiers, the first 10 of you will receive this pin designed by my wife. I gave her a bunch of pieces of art to select for the pins that we were going to use, told her to surprise me, and she ended up using a selfie that I took. So, first 10 of you who sign up to be a courtier, including the first 4 who are there now, will get one of these pens if you send us your address. Anyway, I love you guys. I will be continuing these story times. I just didn't want to look like I had been looking. I wanted to, you know, dress how I am instead of feeling like a, I don't know, like poop stuck to the bottom of the shoe. That's what I kind of felt like. So I didn't want to feel like that anymore, so I kind of had to fix myself up a bit. Anyway, I love you all. Thank you for listening to this story time. If you have any requests for anything in the future, anything reasonable, then I'll probably do it, because I'm pretty amiable. Anyway, have a good night.